Come with us on a great adventure discovering the Oregon coast. To begin this trip, we'll start near Cape Foulweather, north of Newport. Near the edge of this cliff, 500 feet above the sea, is perched a small gift shop called The Lookout. It enjoys a commanding view and is located near a historically significant place. Walking down this path to the front door, you'll notice to your left a sign attached to a fence that reads, "Where the History of Oregon Began." This is the place where one of the first Europeans, Captain James Cook, made his first sighting of the Oregon coast, and what he saw was this rocky outcropping. Because of the inclement weather, he called it Cape Foulweather. Even though Captain Cook was one of the first Europeans to sight the Oregon coast, it was actually here, further north in Tillamook Bay, where the first white explorer landed in the Oregon Territory. It was American fur trader Captain Robert Gray who, on August 14, 1788, sailed his ship into Tillamook Bay and dropped anchor. He was also the first to sail his ship up the Columbia River, which he named after his ship, the Columbia. Partly as a result of the findings of Captain Robert Gray, President Thomas Jefferson sent an overland expedition to the Oregon coast. It was organized in 1803 by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Captain William Clark. They put together a group of explorers that took about 18 months to reach the west coast. Sacagawea, a Shoshone woman, was hired because she was able to speak 3 Native American languages. Her help was an important key to the success of the expedition. The last half of the journey was made in dugout canoes similar to these. They came down the Snake River, which emptied into the Columbia, that eventually brought them to the Pacific coast. When their flotilla of canoes reached this point of land, actually on the Washington side of the Columbia, they realized that they were at the end of their journey. So they went ashore and made camp about 200 feet to the left of where this small church stands. They stayed in this place for about 10 days and traded with the Chinook natives that lived in a nearby village. It was determined that this was not a suitable place to spend the winter. The explorers decided to cross the river and travel up Young's Bay through what is now known as the Lewis and Clark River to this spot where they pulled their canoes ashore. About 200 yards up a hill, they built a stockade where they spent the winter. They called it Fort Clatsop after the friendly Indians who lived in the area. Because they left some fairly detailed drawings of the fort, it was possible to build a reasonably accurate replica on the same spot where the original stood. This gate at the rear of the compound was the one that led down to the spring where they got their water. This is the spring itself where the water comes out of the ground. On January 8, 1806, William Clark and some members of the expedition set out to find a beached whale they'd heard about that was on the other side of what is now called Tillamook Head. This wood carving commemorates the event. It's located in a small park overlooking the beach where the whale was found. When they arrived, the Indians were in the process of rendering out the whale blubber from a 105-foot-long whale. They purchased 2 gallons of oil and 300 pounds of blubber. This is Ecola Creek, which was named by William Clark. It's right here where the creek meets the ocean where they found the whale. A short distance from Ecola Creek, at the town of Seaside, is found what the local residents refer to as the Salt Works. It's the place where Lewis and Clark's men boiled seawater in order to make salt for their return journey. The 3 men that did the salt recovery began on January 2nd of 1806 and worked night and day until February 20th and were able to extract about 4 bushels of salt. This is a Clatsop Native American woman, Jenny Mitchell, who lived until 1905. She recalled her mother telling her about white men boiling seawater at this place. A few miles from Fort Clatsop is found this exact replica of a Clatsop Indian longhouse, a type of structure the Clatsop Indians lived in. From the late 1700s on, the rocky outcroppings and hidden shoals have caused many shipwrecks. As a result of this continuing risk, a series of lighthouses were constructed in the late 1800s and still stand as a reminder of the perils faced by those who would travel by ship along this part of the coast. This lighthouse at Heceta Head is about 12 miles north of Florence. It was illuminated in 1894 and has an almost storybook appearance. It is said to be the most photographed lighthouse on the coast. While driving north of Florence on the Coast Highway, after crossing this historic bridge, you can turn towards the beach to the beginnings of a trail that winds along the shoulder of the hillside and eventually brings you to the lighthouse caretaker's residence. If you continue on up the hill, you arrive at the lighthouse itself. This lighthouse is located 10 miles west of Tillamook on Cape Meares and was illuminated in 1890. It has a French hand-ground Fresnel lens and is one of only 2 8-sided lights in the United States. The outer surface of the lens is made up of prisms that bend the light into a narrow beam. The beam then passes through a magnifying glass at the center of each of the 8 sides, which intensifies the light and makes it possible to be seen 21 miles out to sea. Here is a smaller version of the same Fresnel lens, and it's on display at the Columbia River Maritime Museum in Astoria. After crossing Yaquina Bay at Newport, you can follow the signs that bring you to the Oregon Coast Aquarium, which is the former home of Keiko the whale. They also have a small Keiko photo gallery that gives a brief overview of his life. These underwater plexiglass walkways go through Keiko's former holding tank, which gives you a rather interesting underwater experience. You are surrounded by water above, on both sides, and part of the floor. They have hundreds of different species represented here, and among them are a couple of large octopus. This is known as the Pacific sea nettle and is a native of the northeastern Pacific Ocean. This one is called moon jellyfish. This is a leafy sea dragon, and it's a cousin to the seahorse and what's called the pipefish. Its frilly appendages are a perfect camouflage for it in the seaweed of its native habitat. Also found living in the same holding tank is a close relative known as the weedy sea dragon. This unusual-looking creature is known as the sea pen, very likely because of its similarity to a pen with an ostrich feather attached. This is a pair of wolf eels that found a convenient hole in the rocks to nestle into. The Oregon Coast Aquarium also has the largest outdoor seabird aviary in North America. These birds are known as the tufted puffin, and they are native to Alaska. Early sailors called them the sea parrot, and they were infamous for stealing bait from the fishermen's hooks as they go into the water. They swim underwater and use their wings to propel them, using their feet only for maneuvering. With puffins, getting airborne is always a touch-and-go matter, and they prefer to dive off of something in order to gain enough speed for flight. This is the sea otter. They never stay still for long. They once lived around the Pacific Rim from Baja California to Japan. However, between their discovery in 1741 and their protection in 1911, the sea otters were hunted nearly to extinction for their beautiful thick fur. There's no longer any wild sea otters in Oregon, although in the 1970s, scientists introduced Alaskan sea otters at Cape Arago and Port Orford on the southern Oregon coast. By the 1980s, the colonies had died out. There have been some rare sightings in the wild, but it is not known if those otters were native to Oregon. Leaving the aquarium at Newport and traveling over 100 miles south past Charleston and Sunset Bay, we come to Shore Acres State Park. A mansion had been built on this site many years ago by one of Oregon's famous lumber barons, Lewis J. Simpson. Unfortunately, it was destroyed by fire in 1921, and the property was eventually purchased by the state. This observatory now stands on the spot where the mansion was. A couple of 100 yards to the south, Mr. Simpson had a quiet little cove with a beautiful private beach. But the most impressive part of Mr. Simpson's estate was this magnificent park, which is now meticulously maintained by the State Park Service. If you drive up the coast to an area north of Newport, one can see the erosion effects of the sea, creating interesting rock formations. One example is the Devil's Punch Bowl. To get there, turn off Highway 101 at Otter Rock, head west toward the ocean. You'll come to this circular pit that has been carved out by the waves rushing in the two openings found near the bottom. There's another example of this found at the foot of Cape Perpetua, a short distance south of the town of Yachats. This channel, known as the Devil's Churn, runs inland from shore and is about 200 feet long. and narrows down to not much more than a deep slice in the rock at the upper end. Here is the often photographed monolith known as Haystack Rock, located just off Cannon Beach. It is approachable on foot at low tide. Cannon Beach was named after a cannon that washed ashore attached to a piece of wreckage that was part of the Shark, a naval survey vessel. The ship was wrecked while attempting to leave the Columbia River on September 10th of 1846. Part of the deck along with the cannon drifted ashore south of Tillamook Head, which gave the name Cannon Beach. This is the original cannon which is kept at the Cannon Beach Historical Society. A number of castings have been taken from it, which can be seen at various places around the town of Cannon Beach. Another one of the unique aspects of the Oregon coast is its many square miles of sand dunes. These dunes at Reedsport are constantly changing as the sand is being moved about by the wind. On the northern outskirts of the town of Florence is the Darlingtonia Wayside Botanical Garden, in which a profusion of rare carnivorous plants grow. If you follow this trail that winds a few hundred feet through the forest, you'll arrive at a natural garden of insect-eating plants called Darlingtonia californica. Insects are lured into the opening under the hood by nectar on the petal-like appendages. Then the insects become trapped in the tube by sharp downward-pointing hairs. After falling into the liquid at the base of the stalk, they are then digested and absorbed as food. Wildlife is very abundant along the coast, and some of them are quite approachable. This is a small group of seals napping on the rocks at Whale Cove. Here is an inquisitive one that came up quite close. These caves are the seaward entrance to a popular coastal attraction, the Sea Lion Caves. An elevator shaft has been cut in the rock that allows the public to go down inside the caves and view the sea lions in their natural environment. Here is a seal sitting on a rock inside the caves. This display is also inside the Sea Lion Caves, the skeleton of a 3-year-old Steller sea lion. She was over 7 feet long and weighed over 320 pounds. The Steller sea lions are year-round residents of the area. Here's a group of them, rather making themselves at home on a dock at Newport Bay. This bridge spans the Columbia River near its mouth, and at the south end of it is the town of Astoria, the oldest American settlement west of the Rockies, and it's only a few miles from Fort Clatsop. This is a drawing of Astoria shortly after it was founded, which showed how it looked in the year 1813, a mere 7 years after Lewis and Clark had left. On a hill overlooking the bay is this Victorian mansion that was built by the famous river pilot George Flavel, constructed between 1884 and 1887. From the upper windows of the cupola, George Flavel used to look out to sea to spot ships in need of a bar pilot to guide them up the river. He would then have someone sail him in a small schooner, the Californian, out to the ship that he would then guide into port. This is a painting of that schooner. This river pilot service was vital to the commerce on the river because many ships had been lost while trying to cross this savage bar, with a wreckage of over 200 of them scattered on the bottom in this small stretch of water. One of the earlier ships to be lost near the mouth of the Columbia River was the Morning Star. It was the first ship built on the Oregon coast, and it was wrecked on the north side of Sand Island on July 11, 1849. This exact replica was launched in July of 1959 after sailing to Portland and a number of other places. It is now on display in the town of Tillamook. This is a side of Mount Neocani. There's been a number of shipwrecks along this part of the coast, but none as puzzling as a wreck of the Glenesslan that ran into the base of Mount Neocani on September 30th, 1913, with a full crew of experienced sailors. The question of why the Glenesslan, on a clear sunny day, should suddenly turn toward shore and run headlong into these basalt cliffs has never been answered. One of the most costly and disheartening shipwrecks was the loss of the Peter Iredale, which ran aground on Clatsop Beach on October 25, 1906, near the mouth of the Columbia River. This photo was taken shortly after the accident occurred, while hopes were still high that it could be pulled off the beach and refloated. But it didn't take long for the Pacific Ocean to take its toll, and the ship eventually had to be sold for salvage. The ship's compass and the ship's bell can be seen at the Columbia River Maritime Museum in Astoria. Over time, the ocean has continued to pound the remains until only a small skeleton is left. It sits like a sentinel on Clatsop Beach near the mouth of the Columbia River, a poignant reminder of the perils ships endure crossing this treacherous bar. The bow of this once beautiful ship, never again to ply the oceans, but now is only one of the interesting artifacts that can be found while discovering the Oregon coast.